The early morning light filtered through the wide glass windows of Bean Brew, an upscale coffee shop nestled in the heart of the city. Known for its carefully crafted espresso and minimalist decor, the coffee shop attracted a diverse mix of early risers from corporate executives and tech entrepreneurs to students and city officials. It was the kind of place where people came not only for caffeine but for networking, for small talk, and to be seen. Amid the morning hum, a striking figure walked through the door, drawing curious glances. This was Nicole James, a well-dressed, self-assured black woman in her late 30s, with an air of quiet authority that seemed to settle over the room as soon as she entered. Nicole was well known in the city, particularly in social justice circles. She was a high-powered attorney who specialized in civil rights cases and had recently made headlines for her role in a high-profile case against the local police department, which had exposed deep-seated issues of racial bias. Her success had not only elevated her professional profile, but had also made her a symbol of change, a figure many admired, and some, especially within the police force, quietly despised. Nicole adjusted her blazer and scanned the room as she waited in line. She had a meeting later that morning with city officials to discuss reforms in policing, and her mind was already racing with points to bring up, data to present, and possible counter-arguments to prepare for. The reform discussions were contentious. She knew that there were people in positions of power who resisted the changes she championed. But Nicole wasn't one to back down. She had worked hard to reach this level, to have a voice that could make a difference. In her field, resilience was as crucial as knowledge, and she possessed both in abundance. As she placed her order, her phone buzzed in her bag. She reached in, glancing at the screen. It was a message from her assistant, reminding her about the meeting's agenda and providing some last-minute updates. Nicole responded quickly, then dropped the phone back into her bag. She could feel a slight tinge of excitement. She was about to go head-to-head with some of the city's top officials, and she lived for moments like these. Meanwhile, another figure entered the coffee shop, and his presence seemed to bring an instant chill to the air. Officer Rick Thornton, a tall, broad-shouldered white man in his mid-40s, exuded an aura of restrained aggression. His posture was stiff, his jaw clenched, and his eyes, though obscured by the brim of his police cap, seemed to scan the room with a mixture of disdain and entitlement. Rick was a 10-year veteran of the city's police force, a man who believed deeply in traditional policing methods and resented the wave of reforms being pushed by activists and outspoken do-gooders like Nicole James. To Rick, people like Nicole represented everything that was wrong with the city's shift in values. He had read about her in the papers, had seen her on the local news, where she would sit with her poised confidence, criticizing law enforcement, exposing cases of abuse, and calling for accountability. The mere sight of her was enough to set his teeth on edge, and seeing her now in the flesh, standing there with her coffee cup in hand, looking so calm and confident, struck a nerve. This was his city, his territory, and here she was, striding in, as if she owned the place. Rick ordered his coffee with a gruff tone, barely acknowledging the barista, his gaze fixed on Nicole. As he moved past the line, coffee in hand, he made no effort to avoid her. With a deliberate bump of his shoulder, he slammed into her, and his steaming hot coffee sloshed out of his cup, spilling onto Nicole's hand and the sleeve of her light-colored blazer. Nicole gasped in pain as the scalding liquid soaked into her skin and clothing. "Oh, excuse me," Rick said, his tone laced with false politeness. He smirked, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he looked her up and down. "Didn't see you there, mess important." Nicole took a deep breath, calming the immediate rush of anger that flared up inside her. She looked down at her coffee-stained blazer, then met Rick's gaze with a steady, unflinching stare. There was a moment of silence as the other patrons in the coffee shop turned to look, sensing the tension between the two. Nicole could see the challenge in his eyes, the smugness, the belief that he could intimidate her, humiliate her, and get away with it. "Seems like you were too busy with whatever it is you do," Rick continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Guess you're not so untouchable after all, huh?" Nicole's expression remained calm, but her mind was racing. She knew this type, she'd faced them many times in her career. Men like Rick Thornton saw her as a threat, not because of anything she had done personally to them, but because of what she represented: change, accountability, and most of all, an unwillingness to accept the status quo. She had expected pushback, but she hadn't anticipated such open hostility. She took a step back, carefully adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and with a calm, measured tone, said, "Well, Officer Thornton, it seems that even in uniform, some people just can't handle a little civility." Rick's smirk faltered for a split second. He wasn't used to people like her talking back, especially not in a setting like this, where everyone could hear. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Nicole didn't give him the chance. She looked around the coffee shop, addressing the room as much as him. "I'm sorry for the disturbance, everyone. I know it can be shocking to witness such blatant displays of unprofessionalism." Her voice was steady, but filled with a cold edge that carried weight. The patrons around them shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others clearly engrossed in the unfolding drama. Rick, now visibly irritated, leaned in closer, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Listen, lady, you may have the whole city eating out of your hand with your little speeches and protests, but out here, you don't have any real power." Nicole met his gaze, her face calm, almost amused. "You're right, Officer Thornton," she replied softly, just loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "The power I have isn't the kind you understand. It's not about intimidation or aggression, but it's far more effective." For a brief moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Rick's face, quickly replaced by anger. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he sneered. "You don't scare me. You don't scare me. You're just another loudmouth who thinks she can change things by whining on TV. But in the real world, people like me run the show." Nicole tilted her head slightly, studying him, as if assessing a specimen under a microscope. "People like you," she repeated his words, letting them hang in the air. "That's exactly why people like me do what we do. Because there are still people like you who think they're untouchable, who believe they can behave however they please without consequences." Rick's fists clenched. She had touched a nerve and he knew it. But before he could respond, Nicole gave him a small, icy smile and said, "Enjoy your coffee, Officer Thornton. While you still can." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Rick fuming behind her. There was a stillness in the room as everyone watched her go, sensing that something much larger had just been set in motion. Nicole walked out of the coffee shop, her heart pounding. Despite her calm demeanor, she could feel the heat of the spilled coffee still tingling on her skin, and a wave of irritation simmered beneath her polished exterior. She had dealt with officers like Rick Thornton before, men who used their position as a means of intimidation, men who felt threatened by anyone who dared to question their authority. But there was something particularly vile about him, a sharp edge to his cruelty that set him apart. She sensed it the moment his coffee scalded her skin, and he smirked in satisfaction. As she approached her car parked across the street, Nicole noticed a familiar figure leaning against the hood, waiting for her. It was Marcus Reeds, a private investigator she had hired for several cases in the past. Tall, sharp-witted, and with a calm, calculating gaze, Marcus was known for his ability to navigate tense situations with a cool head. Today, however, He looked concerned as he took in the stain on Nicole's blazer and the thin redness on her hand where the hot coffee had splashed. "What happened in there?" he asked, crossing his arms. Nicole let out a sigh. "Just a little run-in with one of the city's finest, Officer Rick Thornton. He's clearly not a fan." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That name sounds familiar. He's had some complaints filed against him, right? Aggression, misconduct." "Exactly. But he's managed to avoid any serious consequences so far," Nicole replied. She knew that officers like Thornton were often shielded by layers of bureaucracy, protocols that protected them from facing the repercussions of their actions. She'd seen it time and time again: complaints getting buried, witnesses intimidated, investigations left unfinished. But this time, she felt a resolve harden within her. This time, she wouldn't let it slide. Marcus studied her face, sensing the determination in her eyes. "So, what's the plan?" Nicole gave a slight smile, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "I want everything on him, Marcus. Every complaint, every questionable arrest, every incident of misconduct. I want his record laid bare. We've been trying to expose the systemic issues in the department for a long time, and he just handed me the perfect case on a silver platter." Marcus nodded, his eyes gleaming with understanding. "I'll dig up everything I can find. But be careful, Nicole. Thornton sounds like the type who won't back down easily. Men like him don't respond well to being challenged, especially by someone who threatens their power." Nicole's smile grew a bit colder. "I'm counting on that. Sometimes, to expose someone's true nature, you need to put a little pressure on them. And if he tries anything further, we'll be ready." As she finished speaking, Nicole noticed a shadow moving in her peripheral vision. She turned and saw Officer Thornton himself emerging from the coffee shop, his face twisted with irritation. He had clearly seen her talking to Marcus, and something in his expression told her he didn't appreciate whatever he assumed they were discussing. With an exaggerated sigh, Thornton strolled over, attempting to mask his irritation with a thin veneer of arrogance. Well, he sneered. "Seems like you're quite the busybody, Ms. James. A lawyer and a private investigator. Who would have thought?" Nicole met his gaze, unflinching. "I believe in covering all my bases, Officer Thornton, especially when dealing with people who think they're above the law." His jaw tightened, and she could see the barely contained fury in his eyes. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Running your little crusades, trying to make the rest of us look like villains. But out here, I'm the one with the authority. I'm the one who gets to decide what's right and what's wrong." Nicole kept her tone steady, refusing to be intimidated. "Authority doesn't mean you're right, officer. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to harass people just because they stand up to you." "Harass?" Thornton scoffed, glancing around with a smirk. "Who's harassing anyone? I simply had a little accident with my coffee. Can't blame a guy for being a bit clumsy." "But we both know that wasn't an accident, don't we?" Nicole replied, her eyes narrowing. "That was a statement, officer, and it's one you're going to regret." Thornton's smirk faltered for a brief second before he leaned even closer, his tone shifting to something darker. "You think you can scare me? Let me tell you something, Ms. James. I've been in this city a long time and I know how things work. People like you come and go thinking you can change the world. But at the end of the day, this city belongs to men like me. Men who understand what it takes to keep order." "Order," Nicole repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "Is that what you call it? Intimidation, bullying, abusing your power?" If that's your definition of order, then you're the one who doesn't belong here, officer. The tension between them was almost tangible, a thick, charged silence that seemed to freeze the air around them. A few passers-by slowed their steps, glancing curiously at the confrontation unfolding on the sidewalk. Thornton seemed to notice the attention as well, and he took a step back, plastering a smirk on his face to mask the anger simmering beneath. "You're treading on thin ice, MS. James," he said, his voice filled with warning. "People like you need to remember their place. Don't think for a second that a few fancy degrees and a little fame make you untouchable." Nicole crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "Thank you for the advice, officer. But I don't intend to stay in my place, especially if it means allowing people like you to trample over others without consequence." Thornton clenched his fists, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could say anything, Marcus, who had been watching the exchange quietly, took a step forward. "Officer," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm, "I'd suggest you step back. Unless, of course, you'd like your behavior here documented as well." Thornton shot him a glare, but Marcus remained unfazed, holding his gaze with an air of quiet authority. After a moment of tense silence, Thornton scoffed and shook his head, taking a few steps back. "Fine," he sneered. "Enjoy your day, MS. James. Just remember, this city has a long memory. You push too hard, and it'll push back." With that, he turned on his heel and strode off down the street, muttering under his breath. Nicole watched him go, a mixture of frustration and determination settling in her chest. She knew this wasn't over. Thornton wasn't the type to back down so easily, and his parting words were a clear warning. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced down tougher opponents, and she knew that people like Thornton thrived on intimidation. The only way to confront them was to stand firm and refuse to be silenced. Marcus turned to her, raising an eyebrow. "Well, that was intense. Are you sure about this, Nicole? Men like him don't give up without a fight." "I'm sure," she replied, her voice resolute. "He thinks he can scare me into backing down, but he has no idea who he's dealing with. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. And this time, we're going to make sure the whole city sees him for what he truly is." Marcus nodded, a small smile of admiration tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's get to work. I'll start gathering everything we need. By the time we're finished, he won't have a leg to stand on." As they walked toward her car, Nicole felt a surge of determination coursing through her. Officer Thornton had just made a critical mistake. He had underestimated her resolve. She knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to fight. And if it meant exposing Thornton and others like him, then so be it. Because some battles weren't just about personal victory. Some were about setting a precedent, about drawing a line in the sand, and Nicole James was ready to do whatever it took to make sure that line was never crossed again. Nicole spent the rest of the morning preparing for her meeting with city officials, trying to push the incident with Officer Thornton out of her mind. But it was difficult. Every time she glanced at the faint burn on her hand or caught the smell of stale coffee on her blazer, she was reminded of the disdain in Thornton's eyes, the smug satisfaction he'd shown as he attempted to humiliate her. She had faced plenty of adversaries in her career, but something about Thornton's open aggression left a bitter taste. The conference room in City Hall buzzed with pre-meeting energy as she entered, her assistants and the officials already seated around a large oval table. The room was a mix of older city officials, most of them white men, and a handful of younger representatives who had recently joined the department in various administrative capacities. Nicole took her seat at the head of the table, placing her folders and tablet in front of her with precision. She could sense the tension in the room. Some of the older officials barely looked at her, and she knew why. This wasn't the first time she had faced resistance in these halls. Today's agenda was the next phase of her proposal to bring accountability and transparency to the police department. It included the implementation of a civilian oversight committee, one with authority to investigate complaints independently. Nicole had worked for months to push this proposal through the city's various bureaucratic channels, facing delays, watered-down revisions, and endless debates. But she had persisted, determined to give citizens a voice and to provide real consequences for officers who abused their power. Just as the meeting was about to begin, the door opened, and someone entered, drawing Nicole's attention. She recognized him instantly. It was Captain Robert Mills, a senior member of the police department who had often appeared on the news defending police traditions and publicly criticizing efforts to interfere with law enforcement practices. Captain Mills was the kind of officer who clung to old-school methods, resistant to change and deeply resentful of the reform movement led by people like Nicole. "Ah, Ms. James Mills greeted her with a forced smile as he took his seat. "I see you're as dedicated as ever to improving our department." Nicole met his gaze evenly. "Good to see you, Captain Mills. And yes, I am. I take it you're here to contribute to today's discussion." "Absolutely," he replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "It's always important for me to understand what's being proposed in the name of progress." The subtext in his words wasn't lost on her, nor on the others in the room. Nicole could feel the subtle antagonism, the unspoken reminder that she was an outsider in this world of policing. But she didn't let it show. She had spent years honing her ability to remain calm under pressure, to let her actions speak louder than the snide remarks of people who felt threatened by her presence. As the meeting got underway, Nicole presented her proposal with precision and confidence. She outlined the need for civilian oversight, citing statistics and case studies from other cities that had successfully implemented similar programs. She discussed the benefits of transparency, the impact on community trust, and the importance of holding officers accountable for misconduct. Her voice was steady, clear, and unapologetically firm. Captain Mills listened with a fixed expression, occasionally exchanging glances with some of the older officials who seemed to share his skepticism. When Nicole finished her presentation, he leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Ms. James, you speak a lot about trust and accountability," he began, his tone measured. "But I can't help but wonder if you truly understand what it's like out there on the streets. You see, the people who work under me face dangers every day, putting their lives on the line to keep this city safe. And now you're asking them to have their every move scrutinized by civilians who don't have the slightest idea of what it means to wear the badge." Nicole met his gaze with calm determination. "Captain Mills, I fully acknowledge the sacrifices made by the police force. But accountability isn't about punishing officers who are doing their jobs. It's about addressing the behavior of those who misuse their power. You and I both know that a lack of oversight can lead to abuses. And that hurts not only the community but also the reputation of the department." Mills let out a dry chuckle. "So you're saying my officers are a threat to their own reputation? Perhaps, Ms. James, you've been reading too many sensationalist headlines." Nicole felt a flicker of irritation but kept her composure. "I'm saying that oversight and accountability are essential for any institution. Wouldn't you agree, Captain Mills, that an officer who abuses their authority reflects poorly on the entire force?" Mills hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. He clearly didn't appreciate being cornered with logic, but Nicole wasn't about to let him wriggle out of it. Before he could respond, another official, Councilman Harris, a younger representative known for his progressive views, interjected. Ms. James is right, Captain. This isn't about tearing down the department. It's about ensuring that those who wear the badge live up to the standards we expect. No one is immune to accountability, not even law enforcement. The councilman's support surprised her but was a welcome reinforcement. She nodded in gratitude, glancing around the room as she sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Mills appeared visibly frustrated, his jaw set, but he forced a smile, masking his irritation. After the meeting, as the officials began to file out, Nicole gathered her things, relieved yet energized by the progress she had made. But as she left the conference room, she saw Captain Mills lingering in the hallway, clearly waiting for her. Ms. James, he called out as she approached, his tone cool but with an edge of hostility. I've heard that you had an encounter with one of our officers this morning. Officer Thornton, I believe. Nicole's eyes narrowed. She hadn't expected Mills to bring up the incident so directly, but she refused to show any sign of intimidation. Yes, Captain Mills. I did encounter Officer Thornton. He behaved in a way that was less than professional. Mills's smile was cold. Thornton's a good cop, Ms. James. He may be a little rough around the edges, but he's someone we can count on when things get tough. I wouldn't read too much into a little coffee spill. Accidents happen. Nicole felt a surge of anger, but forced herself to remain composed. Captain, what happened this morning was no accident. Officer Thornton made it very clear that he has little regard for people who don't fit into his worldview. And if he behaves this way with me, I can only imagine how he treats others. Mills let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Ms. James, you have to understand that policing is a hard job. Sometimes officers develop a certain edge, but that doesn't mean they're bad cops. You've got to learn to pick your battles. Going after Thornton will only bring you trouble. Nicole held his gaze, her expression unwavering. With all due respect, Captain, I think it's high time that officers like Thornton learned that they can't get away with everything. Accountability is coming, whether you like it or not. She brushed past him, her determination hardening with every step. She was done playing their game, done with their veiled threats and condescension. This wasn't just about her or the incident in the coffee shop. This was about a system that allowed officers like Thornton to act with impunity, knowing that they would be shielded by people like Mills. But as she left City Hall and walked toward her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thornton wouldn't take this lying down. Men like him thrived on intimidation, on forcing others into submission, and she had just drawn a line in the sand. Nicole reached her car, unlocking it with a flick of her remote. She was about to slide into the driver's seat when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus. He met with some contacts. Thornton's history is worse than we thought. Just the tip of the iceberg. We need to meet. A chill ran down her spine. She'd known Thornton was trouble, but if there was more to his past, if there was a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked or hidden, this case could be even bigger than she'd anticipated. She texted Marcus back, setting up a meeting for later that evening, and made a mental note to contact a few other trusted allies who might be able to assist. As she drove through the city streets, Nicole's mind whirled with thoughts and plans. This wasn't just about proving a point or standing her ground. This was about exposing a corrupt system that allowed officers like Thornton to terrorize the very people they were sworn to protect. And if Mills and others in the department were protecting him, then she had an even larger battle ahead. That evening, Nicole met with Marcus in his office. The room was dimly lit, filled with the faint scent of coffee and old books. Marcus had a folder open on his desk, and from the serious look on his face, she could tell that whatever he had found was troubling. "This isn't just about Thornton," Marcus began, gesturing to the documents spread across his desk. "There's a network within the department, a group of officers who cover for each other, who have been working together to intimidate, harass, and in some cases even frame civilians." Nicole felt a knot form in her stomach as she scanned the files. The pages detailed complaints, accusations, and internal memos that hinted at a disturbing pattern of behavior. Thornton's name appeared multiple times, alongside a few others who were known for their aggression and lack of accountability. "If this comes to light, it could be a bombshell," Marcus continued. "But you have to be careful. People like Thornton and Mills, they don't just stand by and let someone expose them." Nicole looked up, her resolve stronger than ever. "Then we'll have to make sure they don't have a choice." Nicole sat in Marcus's office, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the documents spread before her. Each page represented a story, a life affected by Thornton's unchecked aggression and the protective culture within the department. With every piece of evidence, her determination hardened. But beneath it all, a flicker of apprehension began to grow. The forces she was challenging were larger and more dangerous than she'd initially realized. "These officers have been operating like a gang within the department," Marcus said, his voice low but edged with urgency. "They cover each other's tracks, intimidate witnesses, and suppress any complaints filed against them. Thornton's just one of several, but he's clearly among the worst. And the others? Well, some of them are high up. It's no wonder complaints disappear." Nicole absorbed his words, her mind racing with the implications. What had started as an isolated incident, one man's open display of hostility, had revealed a web of corruption that stretched far beyond Thornton alone. "Do we have enough to go public with this?" she asked, her gaze intense. "Not yet," Marcus replied. "The complaints are here, but many lack concrete evidence. Victims who filed them were often intimidated into silence. Without more, it could look circumstantial. We need someone credible from inside the force, someone willing to confirm that this network exists and provide details." Nicole clenched her jaw. Finding someone within the department who would speak up was a tall order. The cost of betrayal would be high. Anyone who stepped forward would face retaliation from their own colleagues. But she couldn't turn back now. Just then, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression shifting. "It's a message from a source of mine in the department," he murmured. "Apparently word of your encounter with Thornton has spread, and it's caused quite a stir." "What kind of stir?" Nicole asked, her brows furrowing. "Let's just say you're on their radar," Marcus replied, looking up at her with a hint of caution in his eyes. "And Thornton isn't the type to leave things alone. My contact says he's got his sights set on you, which means he might start getting desperate." "Cornered animals, Nicole." Nicole's mind raced. Thornton knew she wasn't an easy target, yet the thought of her moving against him, of the possibility of his exposure, clearly threatened him. "Let him come for me," she said firmly. "I'm not backing down." The next few days felt like a blur, each one bringing new developments, new tensions. Nicole spent her time gathering more testimonies, diving deeper into Thornton's past cases, and speaking with contacts in the legal world who might support her should she decide to escalate. She didn't say it aloud, but a quiet anxiety had begun to creep in. Thornton wasn't just another officer, he was someone who had operated with unchecked power for years, and that kind of power rarely surrendered without a fight. It was on the fourth day after her meeting with Marcus that her phone rang, displaying a blocked number. She picked up, her voice steady. "This is Nicole James." There was a pause on the line before a voice, one she didn't recognize, male and slightly shaky, came through. "Ms. James, I think I have information you need. About Thornton." Nicole's heart skipped a beat. She didn't recognize the voice, but she could sense the urgency. Who is this? I can't say my name. But I work in the department, and I've seen what Thornton's done, what he's capable of. I know it's risky, but I can't stay silent anymore. Nicole leaned forward, gripping her phone tightly. I understand. Thank you for reaching out. Can you meet me somewhere safe? We can talk, and you can tell me what you know. I'll make sure you're protected. The man hesitated, his voice barely a whisper. Yes, but it has to be somewhere far from the station. Thornton and his people, they watch everyone. They arranged to meet that evening in a quiet park on the edge of town, a place away from prying eyes and where her source might feel comfortable enough to share the details she so desperately needed. As she arrived, the autumn air was crisp, carrying a chill that matched her own nerves. She scanned the area until she spotted a man standing near a park bench, his posture tense and his hands shoved into his pockets. She approached cautiously, noticing the weariness in his face. Thank you for coming, she said softly, extending a hand. I'm Nicole. The man nodded, glancing around before shaking her hand. You don't know me, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But I've known Thornton for years. I've seen how he operates, the intimidation, the violence. I wanted to speak out before, but it's dangerous. And he has people who cover for him, people who protect him. Nicole could feel his fear. It was palpable, a reminder of the risks involved. I understand. I can't promise this will be easy, but if we bring this forward with enough support, we can start to dismantle the protection he's had. We just need your story, your testimony. That alone could change everything. He looked at her, his expression shifting between doubt and hope. You don't get it, he said, his voice breaking slightly. Thornton has connections, people who will bury this if they know what I've said. He's not just an officer, he's practically untouchable. Nicole's resolve didn't waver. That's why we have to bring this to light. It's the only way to stop him and others like him from using their positions to hurt others. The man nodded, gathering his courage. I'll do it. I'll testify, I'll give you the evidence. I have records, emails, things that show how Thornton's cases were covered up. But please, you have to protect me. We will, Nicole assured him. She took down his information, agreeing to meet again in a secure location where he could hand over the documents. As they parted ways, Nicole felt a surge of hope. This was the break she needed, the key to finally confronting Thornton and exposing his network of protection. But just as she began walking back to her car, she noticed a familiar figure in the shadows near the parking lot. Thornton. He was leaning against her car, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. He had seen her meeting, perhaps even recognized her contact, and the dark glint in his eyes told her he knew she was getting close to something dangerous. Out for a stroll, Ms. James, he sneered as she approached, his voice laced with mockery. You seem to have a lot of meetings these days. Making new friends, are we? Nicole didn't respond immediately, holding his gaze as she came to a stop a few feet from him. Is there something you need, Officer Thornton? Or is this just another attempt to intimidate me? Thornton's smirk widened. Intimidate? Oh no, Miss James, I'm just concerned for your safety. You've been stirring up quite a bit of trouble, haven't you? Poking your nose where it doesn't belong. People tend to get hurt when they cross the wrong lines. Nicole's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Is that a threat, officer? He chuckled, taking a step closer. Threat? I don't make threats, Ms. James. I give advice. But if you want to see it as a threat, well, maybe that's because you know you're in over your head. Nicole squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. The only one in over their head is you, Thornton. People are starting to see who you really are, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. His smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. We'll see about that. But remember, MS, James, you're the one out here alone, and sometimes even the best of us can slip up. With that, he turned and strode away, disappearing into the shadows. Nicole watched him go, a mixture of anger and determination boiling within her. Thornton's words were clear. He knew she was getting closer, and he wasn't about to let her expose him without a fight. But she wouldn't be deterred. If anything, his threats only fueled her resolve. As she climbed into her car and drove away, Nicole felt the weight of the battle ahead. Thornton was dangerous, yes, but he was also desperate. And that desperation might just be his undoing. The more he tried to intimidate her, the more evident it became that he was running out of options. He was losing his grip, and she intended to pry his hands off the power he'd wielded with such impunity. Over the next week, Nicole worked tirelessly to secure the evidence from her contact, ensuring that each document was carefully catalogued and backed up. She knew Thornton wouldn't stop at idle threats, and her every move was made with caution. Each piece of evidence became a brick in the wall she was building, one that would stand firm against Thornton's aggression. Finally, with everything in place, Nicole knew it was time. The case was ready, and there was no turning back. The night was silent as Nicole parked her car in the dimly lit lot beside Marcus's office. She was cautious now, watching her surroundings with a sharpened awareness. Officer Thornton's behavior had shifted from hostile to outright menacing, and the fear she once brushed off as paranoia had become a constant shadow, following her every step. Inside, Marcus was already waiting. He looked up from his desk, the faint light from his desk lamp casting deep shadows across his face. His expression was tense, and he waved her in with a look that made her heart beat just a little faster. "Nicole," he said as she entered, shutting the door behind her. "You're going to want to sit down for this." Nicole sank into the chair across from him, her fingers tapping anxiously on the armrest. "What is it?" Marcus opened a file on his desk and slid it toward her. She glanced down, scanning the documents. It was a list of reported incidents involving Thornton, stretching back almost a decade. Harassment, intimidation, excessive force, questionable arrests, a laundry list of misconduct that had somehow managed to slip through the cracks, or rather, had been buried. These reports never reached public scrutiny, Marcus explained, his voice low. This list came from a source inside internal affairs. Some of these complaints were dismissed, others were conveniently lost. But they all paint the same picture. Nicole's eyes narrowed as she read through the details. She'd expected this level of corruption, but seeing it laid out in black and white fueled her rage. "How many lives has he ruined?" she muttered, barely able to contain her anger. "And he's still on the streets." "It gets worse," Marcus said, his tone darkening. "Thornton isn't just some rogue cop. He's part of a network of officers who operate under the same code, covering for each other. These are men who enforce their own rules, who see themselves as untouchable." Nicole absorbed his words, the weight of the revelation settling heavily on her. This wasn't just about Thornton, it was about an entire system that enabled and protected him. But if she was going to take this case forward, she would need more than a list of allegations. She needed concrete proof, something that would make it impossible for his superiors to ignore or dismiss. "Thornton's network is tight," Marcus continued, "but they have a weak link. A younger officer, new to the department, who recently filed an anonymous complaint against Thornton. It didn't go anywhere, of course, but this officer might be willing to talk, and if we can get him on record." Nicole's mind whirled with possibilities. Then we'd have an insider. someone who could confirm everything. Marcus nodded. But it won't be easy. Thornton's people will be watching him, and they won't take kindly to anyone breaking ranks. This officer is taking a huge risk by speaking out. Nicole felt a pang of guilt, knowing the danger this young officer would face. But she also knew the power of his testimony. Set up a meeting, she said firmly. We'll take every precaution necessary, but we need his story. 2 nights later, Nicole sat in a small, dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, waiting for the young officer to arrive. The diner was nearly empty, the hum of the fluorescent lights blending with the distant sound of traffic. Marcus had arranged the meeting here, far from the prying eyes of the precinct. Nicole glanced at her watch, feeling a sense of unease as she checked her surroundings. Every shadow felt ominous, every passerby a potential threat. Finally, the door opened, and a young man in his early 20s entered, his face pale and drawn. He looked around nervously before spotting Nicole and making his way over. She could see the fear in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. She offered him a reassuring smile as he slid into the booth across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, trying to ease his anxiety. The young officer nodded, his gaze flickering around the diner. "I don't have much time. If anyone finds out I'm here." "You're safe," Nicole assured him. "We're taking every precaution. I know how much you're risking by speaking to us, and I want you to know how much it means." He swallowed, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "Thornton. He's not just a bad cop, he's something else. I've seen him do things that he trailed off, his voice breaking. Things I can't forget." Nicole leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Tell me everything. Anything you've seen or heard. We need to know the full extent of his actions." The officer took a deep breath, visibly gathering his courage. "Thornton and his group, they target people, Nicole. People who they think deserve punishment. It doesn't matter if there's no evidence or if the person is innocent. If Thornton decides they're guilty, that's all he needs." He paused, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening, then lowered his voice further. "A few months ago, a guy reported one of Thornton's partners for excessive force. A week later, Thornton showed up at his house. No warrant, no paperwork, just made up an excuse to arrest him, roughed him up, and kept him in holding until he dropped the complaint. It happens all the time." Nicole felt a chill run down her spine. "And the department, do they know?" "They know," the officer replied bitterly. "But they look the other way. Thornton's built himself a reputation as someone who gets results, and as long as he's cleaning up the streets, no one cares how he does it. And anyone who tries to stop him, well, they end up in situations that make them think twice." Nicole listened, absorbing each word. Thornton's pattern of intimidation and manipulation was clear, but hearing it firsthand brought a new level of gravity to her mission. She glanced at Marcus, who had been quietly taking notes, his face grim. "We'll protect you," Nicole promised, meeting the young officer's eyes. "I know this isn't easy, but your testimony could save lives. If we bring this to the district attorney, along with the records we have, it could be enough to finally take Thornton down." The officer nodded, a mixture of relief and fear in his expression. "Just make sure it's worth it," he whispered. "Because if this fails, I don't know what he'll do." As he slipped out of the diner and into the night, Nicole felt a renewed sense of purpose. Thornton's reign of terror had gone on far too long, and with this new evidence, she had the power to stop him. But she knew the risk she was taking. Thornton wasn't just a bully in a uniform, he was a man who had wielded unchecked power for years, and he would do anything to protect it. The following day, Nicole received a call from the district attorney's office. They had reviewed the preliminary evidence she'd sent and were prepared to open an investigation. Nicole felt a surge of victory, knowing that her persistence was finally paying off. But she also knew this was only the beginning. Thornton would soon learn of the investigation, and she braced herself for the inevitable backlash. That afternoon, as she left her office, she noticed a figure standing beside her car. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Thornton, his stance casual yet menacing. He glanced up as she approached, a twisted smile on his face. "Congratulations, Ms. James," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hear you've made some friends in the DA's office. Planning a little crusade against me, are we?" Nicole met his gaze, refusing to let him see her fear. "It's not a crusade, Thornton. It's justice." His smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Justice? You think you understand justice? People like you are all the same. You think you can come into our world and change things, but you have no idea what it's like out there." "I know enough," Nicole replied sharply. "I know that you abuse your power, that you think you're above the law. But that ends now. You won't get away with this." Thornton's expression darkened, a flash of anger breaking through his composure. "You think you're brave, don't you? Standing up to me, making all these accusations. But you're alone, Nicole, and when things get messy, people like you have a tendency to disappear." A shiver ran down her spine, but she held her ground. "Is that a threat, Officer Thornton?" He stepped closer, his gaze icy. "It's a warning. You don't know who you're dealing with, and by the time you realize it, it'll be too late." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Nicole standing in the parking lot, her heart pounding. She knew she had pushed him to his breaking point, and she could feel the danger looming over her like a storm cloud. But she refused to back down. Thornton's threats only strengthened her resolve. Over the next few days, Nicole found herself under constant surveillance. Thornton's allies seemed to be everywhere, shadowy figures lingering outside her home, unmarked cars trailing her as she drove through the city. She knew they were trying to intimidate her, to scare her into abandoning the case. But she stayed the course, refusing to let fear dictate her actions. Then, one evening, as she was leaving her office, she received a call from Marcus. His voice was tense, almost frantic. "Nicole, they're coming after everyone involved. I'll witness the young officer. He's gone missing. His family hasn't seen him in 2 days." Nicole's blood ran cold. Thornton was escalating, taking out anyone who threatened his empire. She could feel the walls closing in, but she knew she couldn't stop now. Thornton's desperation was proof that he was feeling the pressure, that his carefully constructed facade was starting to crumble. With a deep breath, Nicole steeled herself. This wasn't just about taking down a corrupt cop, it was about dismantling a system that allowed him to thrive. And as dangerous as the path ahead was, she was ready to face it. Because she knew that real change was never without sacrifice, and she was prepared to pay the price. The following evening, a storm raged outside, thunder rumbling across the city and lightning flashing through the heavy rain. Nicole stood in her office, gazing out at the sheets of water pouring down the window. The storm felt fitting, echoing the chaos that had been steadily closing in on her. Marcus's latest message weighed heavily on her mind. The young officer who had dared to speak out against Thornton was still missing, and there had been no trace of him. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking her concentration. It was Marcus. "Nicole," he said, his voice tense. "I just got word. Thornton's on his way to you." A chill ran down her spine. "Here? Now?" "Yes. I don't know what he's planning, but he's acting reckless. He knows the investigation is closing in on him, and he's desperate. Whatever he has in mind." Be careful. Nicole nodded, steeling herself. Thank you, Marcus. I'll handle it. She ended the call, her heart pounding. She knew this moment would come. Thornton was too arrogant to let her win, and now, cornered and exposed, he was likely even more dangerous. But she was ready. She'd spent weeks gathering evidence, securing witness statements, and preparing a rock-solid case against him. Now all that was left was to stand her ground. The office was empty as she locked the door, a sense of isolation settling over her. She walked to her desk, pulling out a small digital recorder and tucking it into her pocket. If Thornton planned to confront her, she'd make sure there was a record of everything he said. Tonight, she would turn his threats into evidence. Just as she finished, she heard footsteps echoing in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate. She turned as Thornton appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from his coat and his expression cold, almost predatory. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a quiet, ominous click. "MS. James," he drawled, his voice laced with mock civility. "We meet again." Nicole didn't flinch, meeting his gaze with unwavering calm. "Officer Thornton, to what do I owe the pleasure?" He chuckled darkly, stepping closer until he was mere feet away. "I wanted to talk. Thought it'd be best if we settled this privately." "I don't think we have anything left to discuss," she replied, her voice steady. "The DA has the evidence. Your time's up." Thornton's face twisted, a flash of rage breaking through his mask of composure. "You think you can just waltz in here and tear down everything I've built? You have no idea what you're dealing with, Nicole. I've been doing this job for years, keeping this city in line. People like you don't get to take that away." Nicole took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the recorder in her pocket. "What you've built is a system of intimidation and abuse, Thornton. It ends now." He scoffed, shaking his head. "You're delusional. You really think the DA cares about your little crusade? You're nothing but a passing problem to them. Once you're gone, things will go right back to the way they were." "Gone," Nicole repeated, narrowing her eyes. "Is that your plan, officer? To make me disappear like you did the others?" Thornton's gaze darkened, his jaw tightening. "You've got a big mouth, MS. James, and you're making a lot of enemies." He took another step forward, his tone dropping to a low, threatening growl. "I suggest you start watching your back, because accidents happen all the time in this line of work." Nicole's pulse raced, but she held her ground. "This isn't a game, Thornton. Everything you say, every threat you make, only digs your hole deeper." For a moment, Thornton's mask slipped, and she saw the raw fury in his eyes. He was a man used to controlling people, to wielding fear like a weapon. But now, facing someone he couldn't intimidate, he was coming undone. "You think you're so untouchable, don't you?" he hissed, his voice filled with venom. "But you're wrong. All it takes is one mistake, one bad night, and you'll be just another statistic." Nicole's hand tightened around the recorder in her pocket. She knew he was at his breaking point, and if she could get him to admit to even a fraction of his crimes, it would be the final piece she needed. "Is that what happened to the young officer who came forward against you?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Is that why he's missing? Because he tried to stop you?" Thornton's face flickered with a brief, dangerous smile. Maybe he got what he deserved. People should learn to keep their mouths shut. It was all she needed. The confession she'd hoped for, veiled though it was, came spilling out in his own words. The recorder captured everything, and her heart surged with a mixture of relief and determination. "Thank you, Officer Thornton," she said quietly. "That's all I needed to hear." For a moment he looked confused. But then his gaze dropped to her hand, realizing what she held. Fury overtook him, his face twisting with a desperate rage as he lunged forward, grabbing her arm and wrenching it painfully. The recorder slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he snarled, his grip tightening. "You think you can just ruin me and walk away?" Nicole struggled, pain shooting through her arm, but she refused to let him see her fear. "It's over, Thornton. You've already lost." He tightened his grip further, his face inches from hers. "No, not yet." Before she could respond, Marcus burst into the room, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "Let her go, Thornton," he commanded, his voice steady but laced with warning. "The DA's on their way. It's over." Thornton froze, his grip loosening as he glanced at Marcus, calculating his next move. Slowly, he released Nicole, straightening with a sneer. "You're both fools," he spat, his gaze shifting between them. "You think you can change anything? This city doesn't care about people like you." Marcus stepped forward, his expression calm yet defiant. "Maybe not, but it's about to care about you. And when they see what you really are, you'll be the one who's forgotten." Thornton's face contorted with rage, but he didn't move. He knew he was outmatched, that any further aggression would only seal his fate. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The room fell into silence, the tension lingering like a heavy fog. Nicole took a shaky breath, her body aching but her resolve unbroken. She turned to Marcus, her voice steady. "Did you get all of that?" Marcus held up his phone, where he had recorded the entire exchange. Every word, relief flooded through her as she met his gaze. It was over. Thornton's threats, his reign of terror, all of it would be exposed. And this time there would be no escaping justice. As the DA's team arrived to take her statement and secure the evidence, Nicole watched the storm raging outside. The night had been dark and full of danger, but dawn was approaching, and with it, the promise of a new beginning. The following morning, a quiet stillness filled Nicole's office as she sat at her desk, gazing out at the city. The storm had passed, leaving the streets washed clean and glistening under the early sunlight. It was as if the city itself was acknowledging the shift, the end of one chapter and the beginning of something new. News of Thornton's exposure had spread quickly. Local media outlets reported the story with headlines that called out his abuses of power, his intimidation tactics, and his violent history. Nicole had expected backlash, but instead there was an outpouring of support. Citizens who had once felt powerless under the shadow of officers like Thornton now felt seen, heard. She'd even received messages from former victims of Thornton's harassment, thanking her for standing up and giving them hope that justice was possible. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to see a message from Marcus. "Nicole, it's official. The DA's office is moving forward with charges. They're taking this all the way." In a wave of relief washed over her. It was the victory she'd fought for, the outcome she'd risked everything to achieve. But it wasn't just about Thornton. This case had opened the door to a much-needed conversation about accountability, transparency, and the abuse of power within the department. The network of protection that had shielded Thornton and others like him was starting to crumble. As she scrolled through her emails, she noticed one from the young officer who had initially come forward to share his story. He was safe now, back with his family after a few days in hiding, and his message was filled with gratitude. He thanked her for inspiring him to take a stand, for giving him the courage to speak out, despite the fear. Nicole couldn't help but smile. This, she realized, was the real victory, not just removing one bad officer, but empowering others to demand change. Later that afternoon, as she made her way to a press conference organized by the DA's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Reporters lined the front steps of the courthouse, their cameras flashing as she approached. Beside her, Marcus offered a supportive nod, his expression proud. This was a moment that would be remembered, a symbol of resilience and the pursuit of justice. The district attorney, a sharp and committed woman named Lorraine Chen, stepped forward to address the crowd. Her voice was clear, firm. Today, we're taking a stand against the abuse of power. This investigation has revealed serious breaches of trust within our police department. Officers are here to serve and protect, not to intimidate and harm. We will hold every individual accountable, and that accountability begins now. The reporters erupted with questions, hands waving in the air, but Nicole stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of the moment. She felt Marcus's hand on her shoulder, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they had taken on a system built to silence dissent, and they had won. When it was her turn to speak, Nicole stepped forward, her voice steady and filled with conviction. For too long, people like Thornton have believed they were untouchable. Today, we're showing them that no one is above the law. This is not just about one man, it's about every person who has ever been silenced, intimidated, or made to feel powerless. This is a victory for all of them, and it's only the beginning. She paused, glancing around at the crowd, at the faces of those who had come to support her. This city deserves a police force that respects its citizens, that upholds justice, not fear. We're moving forward, and together, we're going to build a system that serves everyone. As the crowd applauded, Nicole felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't anticipated. The battle had been grueling, and there were scars she would carry with her, but it had been worth it. The system had been cracked open, and now, with the public watching, it couldn't be closed again. In the days that followed, Nicole received countless messages of support from community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens who felt emboldened by her victory. A movement was starting, a push for genuine reform. Council meetings were held, discussions of oversight committees gained traction, and calls for policy changes grew louder. People were no longer afraid to speak up, to demand transparency and accountability. One evening, as Nicole walked through the city park where she'd met with the young officer, she noticed people recognizing her, offering her nods of gratitude and words of encouragement. An elderly woman approached her, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for giving us hope." Nicole placed a hand on her shoulder, feeling a swell of emotion. "We're just getting started. Change is coming for all of us." As she continued her walk, a deep sense of peace settled over her. Thornton and those like him had thrived on fear, on silence, on the assumption that no one would challenge their power. But that silence had been shattered. She'd fought not just for herself, but for the city, for everyone who had ever felt powerless. And now the power was shifting. That night, as she looked out over the city skyline from her apartment window, Nicole felt a renewed purpose. The fight for justice would never be over, but now she knew, without a doubt, that it was a fight worth every sacrifice. Because sometimes all it took to make a difference was one person willing to stand up and say enough. And in that moment she knew she'd never stop fighting for what was right.